Hello, my name is Dr. Ron Shore. I am here today, and I've been invited to address something called the biopsychosocial spiritual framework of addiction. So before I get into my content, I'll just give you a little bit of background on myself because I think it helps to explain the lens or the framework I bring to this work. So currently I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Psychiatry at Queen's University, and I'm a research scientist within Queen's Health Sciences, and I generally study drug-related health issues and psychedelic therapies as well. My background is probably of more interest. I've been involved in addiction-related work for about 35 years. I originally started as a needle exchange outreach worker for the Kingston AIDS Project. That was even prior to the founding of their needle exchange program, which became known as Keep Six. So I helped start the Keep Six needle exchange program. And at the same time, I was a prison outreach worker and the first AIDS-based kind of counselor coming from the community to work with federally incarcerated men. And I did that in Kingston in the early 1990s. In 1995, we wrote a proposal and were successful in starting the Street Health Center. So as you may know, Street Health now has had decades of continued excellent work with marginalized communities, focused primarily around addiction medicine and harm reduction. And that is something that I worked with for about 2.5 decades before leaving to complete my PhD. So my doctorate is now specific to the clinical application of psychedelics to treat addiction, as well as depression and end-of-life anxiety. And I currently work as a psychedelic-assisted therapist within the Department of Psychiatry, and I'm an investigator in our clinical trials, and I help design and implement clinical trials for a range of mental health conditions, most recently PTSD-related trials using MDMA and associated therapies to treat PTSD among Canadian veterans. So today I'm talking about addiction. It's important when we talk about addiction to at least acknowledge that this is a loaded term. It's a concept that carries a lot of baggage and judgment, and I would argue a lot of misunderstanding. And so it's important to both understand the science behind our understanding of drug dependence. And that includes not just the kind of brain biology, but also the social sciences and what we know about the social determinants of health and how social factors, conditions can help construct people's vulnerability towards addiction. It's important to understand it not necessarily as simply an individual disorder. And I'm going to explore this whole notion a bit about what these disorders are, how valid they are, and how helpful they are in helping us to understand people with drug dependence or who use substances. So I want to kind of venture into this knowing that it's loaded with a little bit of stigma and that our general literacy in this issue in society is quite limited, generally characterized by a lot of stigma and blame. But we're going to explore a little bit more around some of what the science actually helps us understand. And I want to introduce a holistic, integrated model for understanding addiction that we can call the biopsychosocial spiritual framework of understanding addiction. So first of all, I just want to explore a little bit this notion of what a pathology is. If we're talking about kind of things like depression or addiction or PTSD, these are classifications that clinicians, generally psychiatrists or physicians, would use to categorize or group a list of symptoms that people are experiencing. But it's important that we understand that these disorders as we see them are slightly artificial constructs that help us understand and provide treatment, but at the same time, they are not to be seen as definitive, as rigid, nor as subsuming the larger identity of the person. So when we look at this notion of what a pathology is, I'm going to reference here the work of Dr. James Hillman, who was an American psychologist, and he was a Jungian psychologist. So he looked at archetypes primarily in helping to understand consciousness and the soul and how we experience mental health. And he broke down the etymology or the word history of pathology. And as you can kind of see, he broke it down into the 3 components: psyche, pathos, and logos. Logos is kind of word or language. Pathos is this notion of kind of something, an illness or something that's affecting an organism. And psyche really is our mind or our soul. So what he helps us to understand is when we're talking about pathologies, we don't want to see them as some sort of inert disorders that characterize a person, that subsumes their identity, that they are somehow this classification. But these are things that maybe speak to what the person is experiencing, or in this case, we could understand it as the language of the soul. When we're looking at addiction, it's really an older word, comes out of Greek kind of culture. If you've read Gabor Mate's book, In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts, he does a really nice exploration of the background for understanding of addiction. It's important that we take this word and separate it a little bit from the label of addict. It's really important that we not apply fixed, rigid labels on people like that, because people are so much more than any of these disorders or categories that we impose. And there's a functionality underneath drug use, and particularly underneath drug use dependence, that we need to explore and acknowledge. So addiction is rooted in a Greek term called addictio. And so at its root, it really means simply to be devoted or bound to a practice. In today's culture, I don't think that addiction is a rare phenomena. If we look at just how widespread social media use is, how compulsive it can be, how consuming people's time, either in gaming or internet, or even now the rise of gambling, cell phone addiction, coffee, alcohol, tobacco, let alone some of the more illicit substances, we can understand that addiction is quite widespread in society. In fact, we could say society is swimming in a stream of intoxicants. When we're looking at addiction, we have to understand this notion that it gets to this notion that there's a devotion or you're bound to it in the sense that a certain amount of your time and energy, and therefore your identity, is bound up in the pursuit of this activity. The root of the word also contains a notion that it's to speak or to adjudicate a debt, that somehow there's something that is kind of missing, or that there's something owing to a person. As we can see, the kind of current concept of addiction is somewhat limited. It's characterized in modern usage by a whole lot of moral judgment or stigma. We tend to see addiction as being characterized by a lack of good choice, a lack of self-care. Many myths predominate about addiction, in particular the myth that people are self-destructive in their addictive kind of cycles. But we have to peel away some of these layers of stigma and really help to understand what's going on in these underlying behaviors, and how do we separate or understand individual behavior in the context of the larger social ecology in which we all live. So it's important with addiction that we not judge. It's more likely to be judged because there's a behavioral manifestation. With many of the things that people are suffering with or coping with, they tend to be more silent or contained inside. With addiction, because there's a clear behavioral component, it's easy to look and judge the person. It's easy to look and judge the behavior. I think it's more compassionate, it's wiser, and we're more socially beneficial. I think we understand ourselves better if we can overcome some of the judgment and look at it as a human behavior that is rooted in certain needs, expectations, and that they're determinants or drivers of some of these behaviors, particularly if you look at how widespread addiction is in society. You could even say we have an addiction to fossil fuel, to cars, to power, to money. And there's no doubt with the rise of global capitalism, we've seen a massive tracking expansion of addiction over the last 2 centuries. Today in contemporary kind of mental health world, as we look at kind of how we're kind of addressing this growing epidemic of mental health illness that people are suffering with, or conditions that are becoming more and more prevalent, higher rates of diagnosis of these kind of conditions, we have to understand a bit about the larger context. And here I want to refer to something called the triple crisis in psychiatry, or the triple crisis in mental health. And when we're talking about the triple crisis, we're saying there's 3 different phenomena all coinciding at this time. And this is not even recognizing or acknowledging issues in terms of a toxic drug supply, the regulation of narcotics. We're going to leave that aside for now. We're simply looking at how we're understanding mental health in society today. We can see very clearly, the evidence is clear. I would imagine you, as the learner and viewer who's engaged with this and is interested enough to be attending and listening to these talks, that we can recognize that there are more and more people who are either expressing, coping with, or being diagnosed with mental health concerns or conditions. I think it's clear that COVID and the results of this global pandemic have contributed to a worsening of mental health in general, in particular because there was a lessening of the social fabric and of social supports, an increase in isolation, an increase in fear, And so we've had this kind of exaggeration or exacerbation of mental health, which can be also the result of long-term chronic stress. So the first part of this crisis is we're seeing more and more people coming forward, coping, being diagnosed with significant mental health concerns such as depression, anxiety, substance use dependence. The second part of this crisis is that when we look at our current treatments and we look at something called efficacy or effectiveness, how effective are these treatments in helping people in the community get better or heal from these conditions? And we can see when we look at the evidence that there are limitations on the effectiveness of these treatments. In part, there's an enormous amount of heterogeneity. People will respond differently to the treatments. The majority of science and clinical trials still tend to favor male subjects. We find antidepressants have a slightly less efficacy with people who identify as female. So we know in that regard, there's not equal response. There are genetic variations, there are environmental differences, which means that people respond differently to the treatments, and even the treatments themselves, because we have to remember we're in a pharmacological ecosystem that is still heavily influenced by the American FDA and how they regulate kind of psychiatric and medical treatments. That is a different model of healthcare. It's privatized. There's more incentive to diagnose and treat because there are the payments coming from the treatments that come to the pharmaceutical companies. So these are things that can contort or distort how we're looking at mental health. But we know that our effectiveness in, say, antidepressants, probably somewhere around 40% of people do not respond adequately on the whole to contemporary frontline treatments for depression. And we know that there are side effects to many of the antidepressants, anti-anxiety agents, antipsychotic agents that are commonly prescribed. And some of these side effects can be quite severe. So we know treatments are limited in their efficacy, work better with some people with others, and even then you have this kind of side effect profile, which can make these treatments very challenging for people. The third part of this crisis, which is a kind of a little bit more academic, but I think is super interesting, is that even the notion of the integrity or the legitimacy of these diagnoses themselves are coming into question. For example, if you look at people who are suffering from PTSD due to trauma, it's very common that depression and anxiety are an element or an expression of some of what people are experiencing who may be diagnosed with PTSD. So we have to ask the question, is this a single construct? Does PTSD come with this depression and anxiety, or does the person have 3 different diagnoses? Another example is people who've had traumatic loss or are grieving are commonly diagnosed with clinical depression if the grief process goes on longer than, say, a 3-month period. In traditional cultures, grieving was thought to go on for at least a year, maybe longer. Are we accelerating or having unrealistic expectations of people coping with grief? And are we more likely to diagnose or pathologize what are natural, healthy emotional processes for people, including grief, because we've come to medicalize these kind of experiences of human life? There is a creeping therapization of the world where increasingly in terms of social media, people are very much identifying themselves with their disorders. Some of that is nice in terms of taking the stigma away, but at the same time, we're kind of moving into this realm where we're taking elements of normal human experience and are more likely to pathologize them and see them as an individual fault as opposed to looking at the culture. And I would say ADHD is another example of that. We have a culture that's very fast-paced, that has an enormous amount of kind of visual attention, of stimulation in the environment. Everything moves really, really quickly. People are asked to multitask. That itself is a societal ADHD that we're all inhabiting. At what point does the individual have a diagnosis, or are we looking at a social diagnosis? So I'm just putting this out there to help us understand the social context, or what I would call the social ecology of mental health. As mentioned, it's really hard to investigate or discuss addiction without acknowledging the widespread stigma that is imposed on people who use substances and people who are seen as substance use dependent. And here I'm going to refer to the work of the sociologist Irving Goffman, who has a wonderful book called Stigma: Notes on the Management of a Spoiled Identity, which I would highly encourage everyone to read. It's a relatively accessible book. He talks about addiction as an attribute which is imposed on someone and is deeply discrediting. It's rooted in this ancient practice of tattooing or branding, generally on the forehead, people whose actions or behaviors were seen as transgressing this moral code in Greek society and were deemed to be criminal. So they would literally be branded, which meant that when I would encounter you in a normal social interaction, you wouldn't see me as a whole person. You wouldn't see me as a free citizen with all of the rights and expectations around fairness, equity, respect. What I would be defined by is this tattoo or brand, which marked me as a criminal, which marked me as someone who was bad, mad, or dangerous, and to be avoided. What that does then is it subsumes my claim to any empathy from you or to the fact that I'm more than this behavior that was seen to be problematic. I am more than someone who carries this label. I can be a father, I can be a son, I can be a carpenter, I can have all of this other good work I do. But if all you see is my label, then I'm deeply discredited. And that's what Goffman is referring to as this kind of spoiled identity. It's a general aspect of social life that complicates at a micro level general interactions on a day-to-day basis. And I think as an example of this stigma, I think most people, when they're in a public setting and see a public display of drug use, there's an immediate kind of sense of, oh, this is wrong, or, oh, this person shouldn't be doing this, without understanding the complexities and the precarities of existence that bring people into conditions like that. When we're looking at substances, and in addition to my current work now and my time at Street Health, I taught a course called Introduction to the Study of Drug and Alcohol Problems at Queen's for 15 years. And in that, I would generally teach the history of drug use as the starting point and understanding drug use as normal, natural behavior before looking into things like addiction, the criteria for substance use dependence, how treatment programs work, how recovery programs work. So let's go back to the basis. Let's look at the fact that in human society, if you look anthropologically, or if we look at the archaeological evidence, it is very difficult to find societies that did not consume substances on a regular basis in a ritualized manner across large portions of the society. And generally, these experiences were seen to have social value. The root word of kind of pharmacy is pharmakon. And this is, again, a Greek or Latin term that refers to the fact that these substances can be both medicines and poisons, generally related to the context, the indication, and the dose. Drugs themselves, the term drug, is rooted in the old or Middle English term droog. I think it was French in origin originally. And what this referred to are dried herbs that were stored in barrels. So very clearly, what we're pointing to here is the history of herbal medicine, of medicinal plant medicine, and it's only in more recent times we see drugs as this kind of loaded, morally charged term that we generally have social prohibition for. We have a widespread, now going on more than 50 years, war on drugs that has been cataclysmic to society, has done nothing but encourage more problematic and harmful drug use. But the root itself recognizes the normal interaction humans have had with their environment, in which nature has provided for us various herbs, roots, plants, vines, trees, flowers, all of these things that have medicinal value. Knowing how a plant can be used for benefit and what its risks are is part of traditional ecological knowledge. This kind of knowledge has largely been lost. We have indigenous knowledge keepers and cultures that have kept these traditions alive despite centuries of colonialism. But for most of us, we'd be hard pressed to go into our local forest and find or be able to identify medicinal mushrooms versus those that are toxin, or to know the herbal value or the medicinal benefits of various plants that are in our ecosystem. But it's important to understand that the drugs that make up the large part of our pharmacy that you would access through medical prescription or go to the pharmacy, most of those have their root in traditional plant sources. And it's thought that somewhere, I think it's even between 60 and 70% of the pharmaceutical interventions we used were originally located or began researched out of ethnobotany in the Amazonian region of South America, in the rich diversity of the rainforest, where we have such incredible complexity and diversity of plants. So many of our medicines have come from understanding the plant basis of these. So today, when we say drug, most of us think about illicit drug use. We don't think about the prescription drugs that we are using, but they are all chemical compounds that generally originally had a natural source, often have been replaced with synthetic compositions now made in labs, but they all refer to something that you would take externally, introduce it into your body, consume it through various means or modes of administration to alter the normal operations of the body and mind. In the case of psychiatric medications, these would be psychotropics that would affect how you think, you feel, your affect, the activity of your neurotransmitters. At a more biological level, sometimes these can be compounds that are anti-inflammatories or affect cardiac function. So they're all very specific to the biology of the body, but they're natural in source in general. And humans have had an ancient connection to plants for medicinal reasons that we continue to, I think today, forget, cover over. And I think that if the psychedelics movement is indicating anything, it's that people want to return to a notion of understanding these kind of compounds as being possibly beneficial in the right circumstances, and that there are forgotten traditions of herbal medicine, of knowing of natural compounds that can be of benefit. And we're rediscovering a little bit of our connection to the natural world in this. So in terms of contemporary perspectives on addiction, I think most people today, particularly people who work in the field, and I'm not sure if you're familiar, the viewers here, about something called the ACE study. ACEs are adverse childhood experiences. And the original ACE-related research came out of California probably about 30 years ago. And there was an author named Vincent Felitti. And what we looked at in these studies around adverse childhood experiences were the relation of these experiences to later in life health outcomes. And Felitti and his study team out of, it was Kaiser Permanente Health Maintenance Organization in California, looked at and enrolled people kind of randomized through whether they're showing up for screening for cancer or for a general family doctor medical appointment or for psychiatric care. They took a widespread group of the community and they assessed and interviewed people, and they had them complete questionnaires about early childhood experiences, and were able to conclude on a very large sample size, quite conclusively, that the main determinant to our health are the experiences we have in early childhood, particularly if we suffer or experience, I think there were 7 or 8 different versions of what he called adverse childhood experiences. And they could be things like divorce, separation, childhood abuse, incarceration of a parent, violence, abandonment. And so these are things that we know can affect the development of the human brain, can affect the development of personality. And trauma, particularly in early childhood, seems to be linked to later in life behaviors that maybe are seen as risk-taking in teenage years. They can be more likely to be using substances than people who did not have such high scores in adverse childhood experiences. And he was able to establish quite conclusively a dose-related response, meaning the more trauma people suffered, the more likely they were to die young, to have significant comorbidity of medical conditions. And the findings around addiction were very compelling, meaning we're much more likely to engage, particularly in high-risk drug use, if we've been dealing with significant trauma in our past, which then relocates the locus of responsibility when we're looking at drug use, addiction, the social concerns, the moral phobia over what's happening in terms of substance use. I was raised in the 1970s and 80s, and it was really the Nancy Reagan war on drugs, educational campaigns, and we were exposed to television commercials with eggs frying in a fry pan, and this was your brain on drugs. And it was made to seem like the drugs had all the power, and that the bad guys were the drug dealers. And what we've come to realize through things like the ACE study is that it's not about the drug itself having power. It's about our relationship to the substance and how we're much more vulnerable if we're trying to cope with significant trauma. We have a stronger response to the substance or a greater need to self-medicate if we've had these socially imposed traumatic experiences that generally are not the responsibility of the person who suffered them. So this kind of erodes this notion of addiction as something that's self-willed, as a series of bad choices, and it reframes it a little bit as a self-medication phenomenon. So we have, and you can see on the one quote here, it's not addiction per se or compulsive drug use, but we can look at chronic substance use dependence as ritualized comfort seeking. And there's another American researcher named Edward Cancian, who's actually Canadian by birth, who has popularized this notion of addiction as self-medication. And I think there's great merit to looking at that as well. So we're not necessarily thinking anymore that the drug has all the power, nor that it's the drug dealer at fault, but that it is social policies, the determinants of health, the quality of our communities, the supports we provide, young families, what our children are experiencing in the childcare settings, what they're experiencing in school, what they're experiencing in the home. We need to look at gender-based violence, marginalization, racism, all the other kind of microaggressions that people could suffer. And then we're looking at a more developmental, humane, compassionate understanding of drug use. So again, if we just to summarize, look at the history of addiction, the original application came out of this notion that somehow it was referred to a debt that somebody had owed. It was this devotion or bound to a practice. We need to acknowledge that through human history, inebriation or intoxication is not just common across all human societies, but it is also common across hundreds of different mammals and animals. Elephants, the great apes, monkeys, various other kind of land-based animals, birds are known to be attracted to fermented fruits and will consume them seemingly for the purpose of intoxication. So it's not even simply a strictly human behavior. We also need to acknowledge that when we're looking at addiction, it's not just substance dependence, but they can be behavioral addictions. Pornography dependence, pornography abuse is widespread. Gambling is increasingly widespread, even if you cannot watch a sports game anymore without seeing the superstars of today promoting gambling applications, forgetting that this is a behavior that can have significant negative consequences on people, their families, and society. So we do know that gambling was one of the first addictive behavioral addictions that we've come to acknowledge, but there are more, and I would argue gaming can be an addiction in this way, cell phone dependence, and social media. The rise of drug addiction really is more recent. It's the last couple centuries, and I think it's mostly rooted in the opium trade, the opium wars that happened through the many centuries ago, as people were jockeying for trade routes, and you had this kind of imperialism and expansion through the world as commercial interests. So opiate use transformed from something that was medicinal, was rarely abused, into something that became a coping mechanism and was associated then with certain kind of racial groups. And you saw then the rise of the war on drugs, which has always had a kind of racist undertone as well. Certain communities have always been kind of more specifically targeted when we're looking at the war on drugs, in particular marginalized inner city Black and Asian communities, if you look at the history. So we've talked a little bit about the social history of drug use, and I've introduced some ideas on how to understand the role of social determinants in the evolution of health behaviors. We've addressed stigma as a social kind of characteristic of how we're seeing this through a lens that maybe is not the most informed. But now I want to introduce and delve into a little bit more of the neuroscience behind drug use and substance use dependence. Here we get to examine the wonders of the brain, and in particular, the relationship of body to mind. Now, we're sitting at a point in time in which we have now benefited from probably 3 decades of expansion in terms of our ability to do brain imaging. We can use different kind of machines now that help us see into the inner workings of your brain. It's quite remarkable. We can measure things like blood flow. We can look at electrical activity. We can see communication between different brain regions. So this has radically helped us understand both human consciousness and also some of the health conditions we have, but also the way drugs interact with the brain. So in particular in the United States, the National Institute of Drug Abuse, the National Institute of Health, these would be the largest drivers of addiction-related research in the world. And within the American context, addiction is generally seen as a disease of the brain. I want to take aside the disease notion for now and simply look at some of the dynamics that occur when we use substances, in particular what's happening in the brain. So whenever we're consuming any kind of drug or substance that has a psychoactive kind of effect, what's going to happen is it will affect both the central nervous system, which is your cardiac function, your breathing rate, your autonomic nervous system, but it's also going to affect neurotransmitters. In fact, drugs can only have effect on the brain if your brain has receptors to absorb or to accept these chemical messengers. So generally speaking, what we're consuming as drugs match or are similar to natural neurotransmitters. So a classic example of this is if you look at THC and cannabis use, we know that humans have cannabinoid receptors that are activated when we ingest cannabis. The remarkable thing is you can actually find cannabis receptors in a wide range of animals, but also fish. I think we can acknowledge it's highly unlikely for fish to be ingesting cannabis. So then we're at the point, why do we have these drug receptors? And the answer is clearly that we have endogenous or natural biological networks and systems that use these drug-like symptoms for normal human functioning. And with cannabis itself, it's associated with learning and memory and with appetite, things like that. So when we're looking at psychoactive molecules, they tend to be classified by how they affect the central nervous system. Stimulants accelerate it, depressants slow it. Psychedelics are an unusual grouping of substances that create a generalized disruption of usual brain activity. When we're looking at drug use, we can acknowledge that generally the core phenomena is we're taking something from the external world and through some mode of administration, be it oral, inhalation, smoking it, injecting it, transdermal patches, all these, putting it on your tongue, orally, we can acknowledge that once the method of administration has occurred, you have this remarkable synergy of something that was formerly external to you has been consumed, your body is metabolizing it through a process called pharmacokinetics, and then your brain and your body are responding to the introduction of these new chemicals. So in many ways, this is the way that we consume or ingest the world. Drug use in many ways can even be some sort of recognition of the unity of external and internal. You're taking a substance that was at one point external to you, ingesting it, and it's modifying it. It's modifying you, it's altering your basic perceptions of the world often, how you're feeling or experiencing the world, or how your brain is functioning. So we have to recognize there's interplay or merging of external and internal worlds. There's a concept in drug studies called total drug effect. And this really builds on the recognition that if we're looking at the way in which we use substances and how they have their effect, we need to look at a variety of factors. So generally, most of us started with understanding drug set and setting. And there have been writers like Norman Zimberg, even Timothy Leary popularized this notion that to understand the way in which a substance has its effect on you, we need to understand it's not just the pharmacological effect of the substance, because there'll be such great variation in the way people experience the substance based on their own genetic predisposition, the way their receptors work, their own biology. So drugs are one element. The drug itself and its basic pharmacology and the biological ways in which your body interacts with it is one of the factors to shape your drug experience. A second factor, which has generally been not as well recognized, but is really influential, is what we can call set. And so that is your personality, that is your belief structure, it's your expectations about what you think the drug will do. It's the history you bring, your personality type, your tendencies. Are you someone who tends to be kind of someone who's more of a risk taker? Do you tend to be more conservative? Are you sensitive to your environment? Do you have other things about your psychology that will, when interacting with the drug, condition it to create certain effects? So this is looking at the remarkable variation in the human species from person to person. So we have drug, we have set. And the third general category is setting. And that's the environment in which you're using the substances. That's not just the physical setting in which you're consuming. It can be a bar, it can be your home, it can be a group setting with other people. It can be in a doctor's office. Those are setting. But the larger setting is the cultural matrix. What your society is telling you about this form of substance use, your belief structure about the drug itself, and the general social approbation, which means support or discouragement of this kind of drug use, will also condition its effect. So those are the three core factors. Kevin Feeney, who's actually a Canadian researcher, kind of evolved this into a more holistic model looking at 5 factors, and he called it total drug effect. So you have the pharmacology of the medicine, you have the participant's belief about themselves and about the medicine, what you think it will do. And then you have a third factor he is identifying, which is your belief and trust in the healer. So in this context, if it's a medication prescribed by a psychiatrist, it's your belief in psychiatry, in this psychiatrist. How much can you trust? How educated does this intervention seem? How rational? How scientific does it seem? That means that if you believe in the treatment, it introduces a somewhat placebo effect, meaning you're more likely to have a positive response because you believe in this course of treatment. The fourth in Feeney's examination, and I have to acknowledge his literature comes out of looking at and understanding traditional peyote ceremonies, particularly those coming out of indigenous kind of contexts within Canada and the US. Peyote ceremonies have been a way of cultural survival. It's been pan-cultural across different indigenous groupings. It continues to this day. There are several legal peyote churches in Canada and United States. His research was looking at the way in which peyote in those ceremonies had its effect. But I think that's a helpful way for us to understand drug use in general. So the other element he identifies as the fourth in this common total drug effect theory is the immediate setting of the ceremony, including the rituals involved. So in the case of peyote ceremonies, they're social, they're ritualized, people have different roles, they take place in a teepee, there's a fire. So you can understand they go all night till dawn. And so all of that ceremonial aspect conditions the effect of the peyote for the participant as well. And then finally, as I indicated, the larger cultural matrix of beliefs and values really does help shape the experiences of people because it loads us with certain sets of expectations or judgments. So bring ourselves back to the core topic here. I want to just kind of consolidate this kind of framework for you a little bit and break down the different components of what we would see as this holistic or integral biopsychosocial spiritual framework of addiction. So we're saying it's not just the drug that has an effect. We're saying it's not just the individual and their vulnerabilities, and it's not just the society, but it's all of those things combined to create these experiences. The biological component would be your body, the substance itself. The psychological component is your own expectations, how you respond to these substances, what your needs and wants are, what your resiliency factors are like, what your personality is. So we know the biology of the drug and your own biology have an influence. Some people, it is thought that generally, when you look at the genetic influence in terms of predisposition towards addiction, again, referencing the American literature, generally it's thought, if you look at the think tank through the National Institute on Drug Abuse, that somewhere between 40 and 60% of our susceptibility to substance use dependence or addiction is genetic in component. So we inherit certain kind of cellular apparatus from our parents, from their socialization, from ancestors before, which can, for example, make it more or less likely for you to have certain responses to certain drugs. That is something we call receptor occupancy potential. Some of that is at birth. A lot of that is then conditioned, and we know within genetics, the newer concept is epigenetics, which is your genetics only express themselves in response to the environment that you're inhabiting and growing in. So you have this interplay of nature and nurture. So there's a biological element, there's a psychological element, but we need to understand that our minds, our psychologies, our souls, for lack of better words, are in a social environment. We're not islands. We are not existing in a vacuum. Generally, often the approach in medicine is to look at just the individual's biological function, ignoring the fact that we live in context, that we exist within an ecosystem, that so many of the influences that our biology is coping with are external. It can be things like external pollution. It can be things like external stress. And as a psychedelics researcher, for me, one of the interesting things that we have to kind of explore a little bit more here is even the way in which your neurotransmitters like serotonin are themselves environmentally tethered, meaning we know serotonin is related to depression, feelings of well-being, but your serotonin levels itself are directly tied to your experiences of your environment in a way in which it's a neurotransmitter that binds you to your context. So there's this sensitivity to context we have here. So even your neurotransmitters aren't existing, firing, regulating in isolation, but always within a social context. When we look at society and we understand the importance of acknowledging the determinants of health, we will see things like the health of your community affects your well-being. Are you living in a healthy neighborhood? Can you walk to where you need to get? Is it safe in your neighborhood? Do you have adequate housing? Do you have your social needs taken care of? let alone things like belonging, having meaningful vocation, having a community you can participate in. But we know that our social policies directly affect our health and directly affect drug use. The prohibition on certain substances is a clear indication of that. The war on drugs creates higher risk drug use, contributes to both the drug toxicity crisis and the overdose epidemic. So those are social policies that are creating drug-related harm. So that's what we mean by there's a social element to this framework. And many people would argue that addiction itself can be understood really as a condition of feeling great dislocation or disconnection, and that the opposite to addiction, to quote one speaker, is connection. And so we need to understand the social component of addiction as well. The spiritual side of this is also worth noting. This has kind of been more recently added to this framework to recognize that often what we're seeking in our substance use or in many of our health behaviors is a sense of meaning, is a sense of belonging, is the ability to connect to your environment, to connect to your own sense of purpose, of self, to feel and experience things of deep meaning, conditions of awe. These are things that we would generally see as a more spiritual component and are definitely a part of the kind of addiction phenomenon, because people are in and out of altered states of consciousness. Dealing with kind of altered states means that we're in a place where we're kind of transitioning between different states of being, different levels of consciousness. So there's often for people through their drug use, they're trying to satisfy a spiritual need or may even be some sort of way of spiritual exploration. I want to touch here on a very important theory called the dislocation theory. This was, again, a Canadian psychologist and researcher named Dr. Bruce Alexander, who is most famous for his rat park experiments. You may know the rat park experiment through media or hearing people talk about it, but it was a fascinating set of experiments that Alexander carried out at the University of British Columbia through the period 1978 to about 1981. And really what he was able to look at was the isolation of lab animals really drives the self-administration of drugs. And really he helped us understand the importance of social context and particular environmental enrichment when we're looking at health. So to explain the experiments, generally the way animal research works, and animal research is problematic on a lot of different levels, in part, how transferable or translatable are these to human experiences. But a lot of early addiction science, research, literature used animal models in which you took caged rats largely, and you would offer them a choice of, say, sucrose, which is a natural sugar as a form of food or nutrition, or something like cocaine or opiates. And in these studies, the rats would often self-administer the narcotic to the point of creating illness, possibly even death. And that, if you understand it alone without looking at the larger context, you could see, oh, the drug is problematic. The drug is creating this addiction response, this reward. And so the animal's coming back and back and back and self-administering to the point of destruction. What Alexander was able to do was expand our understanding and look at the social context of these experiments, deconstruct them a little bit to understand what is it exactly they are signifying. So in contrast to the caged individual rat, and you have to remember rats are mammals, attachment is key, socialization is key, richness in environment is key. If you live in a cage and you have experiments conducted on you, you will feel a lot of stress and trauma. What Alexander did was create this utopian rat park, and it was a large room. The rats were able to socialize. They weren't kept in isolated chambers or cages. They would have opportunities to play, to reproduce, to eat, to hide, to sleep. All the natural rhythms of animal life were encouraged. What he found in that context was this drive to self-administer cocaine or heroin basically was extinguished. It went to very low levels because when rats had other options, such as social reward, social belonging, play, other forms of biological health, and were not subjected to this intense chronic stress, they failed to self-administer these narcotics, even when they were available to them. So again, that lessens the notion that the drug has all the power, and now we're looking at the environment as holding the key or as the setting to understanding addictive behavior. So he developed a theory called dislocation theory. And Alexander's main message is that it's the lack of psychosocial integration that underlies addiction. And those are things like the belonging we all seek, our notion of identity, a connection to others. Alexander understands addiction as a recent phenomena that coincides largely with the spread of global industrial capitalism, and the notion and the historical reality that traditional supports, either land-based communities, clan-based structures, social supports that were meant to be community and kinship, have been eroded or dislocated in order to move into more capitalist, individualistic, nuclear family settings where people are working all the time. There's not a connection as much to community. People have their own individual house, their own individual washing machines, washers, dryers, less social engagement, less social belonging, less multi-generational families, fewer community connections. So the whole notion of a village has been eroded. And due to this lack of psychosocial integration, feeling you're part of something whole, you belong to a group, your identity is one of value to a larger community, that addiction has resulted as a way of adaptation to sustained dislocation. So this would be similar to the sustained chronic stress of the lab animals. Of course, they would self-administer something that would give them an alteration of that, could soothe them to help escape that. So addiction in this way is a substitute for what would normally be a general sense of belonging or purpose in community. Again, Alexander highlights the destruction of traditional societal supports. And then now we have to understand in contemporary setting, when we're looking at addiction, we're understanding it as an individual phenomenology. This person needs to go to treatment, they need addiction medicine, AA is going to help them. But what we're not understanding is the need for social restructuring and the way in which society and the trends over the last 100 years have directly contributed to contributing this sense of dislocation for people. When we look historically, as I mentioned, it's very hard to find societies with historical records who did not use intoxicants to some degree. The only real exceptions would be cultures and societies in the far north, where you don't have like plants and trees. But even in those contexts, fasting, breath work, throat singing would commonly be used as a way of altering or conditioning consciousness. Historically, we need to acknowledge that intoxicants or substances have had some sort of value for people. We know that there are archaeological records going back thousands of years where we can look at evidence found in kind of generally they're often like funeral settings or death practices where we see evidence of things like of cannabis use, of opium use, of natural psychedelic use. And generally these were seen as historically plants or medicines that would be used in a socialized ritualistic context to add some sort of like either spiritual value or to create experiences of the non-ordinary. Traditional societies would view experiences of non-ordinary consciousness as having value. In today's society, we tend to have a consciousness that is flattened, that is seen as one-dimensional. We think that the world exists independently of us and objectively so, and that we're all experiencing the same world. Phenomenologically, we know that's not necessarily true, and that if people ingest certain substances, they can experience the same reality quite differently. And for many people, if these substances are used with reverence, ritualistically, in a way that's socially valued, they have historically been seen as adding either a spiritual value or brought people into social ritual together. So in this slide here, you'll see I've just quoted one kind of researcher who is more interested in kind of Indo-spiritual religious traditions, Hinduism, the rise of Buddhism. And here you can see here that the Hindi word for intoxication relates not just the act of being intoxicated, but also this kind of this desire, this rising of something, that there's something that there's an upward movement in intoxication. People are desiring something. Most of us will use substances in some way or the other, whether it's your morning caffeine or a drink after work. There's some value in these that we take. I've often thought that that value has to do with self-control. We live in a world of a lot of stress, a lot of demands. Using a substance can give you a sense of temporary relaxation, escape, soothing, and it's something you can do for yourself that does not rely on your larger environment. So there's an attraction there. But we do know that not just humans, but animals have this desire to seek altered states. Religious exaltation, which often includes feelings of awe or connectivity to the larger whole, is often experienced under some psychoactive substance use, particularly with psychedelics. But we want to understand then that intoxicants and the use of substances is a natural anthropological factor of human life and of society. And what we want to look at is the relative risks and benefits, not whether drugs are good or bad, or people should or shouldn't be doing this, but what experiences are they creating? Do these experiences have value? Do they create harm? And how can we create social contexts or rituals that reduce harm while introducing or increasing value? Here, I just want to pause and explore a little bit more about this notion of non-ordinary states of consciousness. We know that there are various ways that people can experience a sense of either mysticism, of transcendence, deep relaxation, mindfulness, oneness with things that do not involve the use of substances. We know that psychoactive drugs, such as psychedelics, can lead to experiences like that, feelings of great awe, experiences of unity consciousness. But we know more naturally, meditation practices, which are thousands and thousands of years old, have been practiced not just in the Indian subcontinent, but throughout the world to create a sense of unity consciousness, of connection to something beyond the ordinary realm, and to develop a sense of inner peace. Breath work, traditionally known as pranayama, is increasingly popular. It helps to regulate the nervous system, and it can change consciousness in a similar way that substances can. We know hypnosis can create trance states. We know people can experience trance states through things like religious kind of exaltation. We know that things like float tanks, which were traditionally called sensory deprivation chambers, can also create the sense of an altered consciousness. Think about your dreams. Think about every night when you sleep. You're having an experience of something you're believing is real and you're participating in, but is entirely fabricated by the workings of your brain and unconscious. We know also that altered states can be created by rhythmic drumming, by ritualized dancing, by movement, but also by things like natural wonder and a sense of awe. So many of you will be familiar with this next image, and this is a representation of Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs. In terms of understanding human health, our psychological well-being, and our place in the world, he's created this kind of framework for helping us to understand the various dimensions or components to human activity and to well-being. As he's famously posited, it's a pyramid with the foundation being your physiological needs. So obviously things like food, shelter, having a habitat, having your physiological needs met is essential to human life. Above that level, as we kind of build towards the pinnacle of human life, he has identified things like safety. Are you secure? How precarious is your living environment? If you're not safe, it's very much more challenging to flourish or to achieve your true potential. After safety comes love and belonging. This is this notion of attachment, of acceptance, of social connectivity. Even the human body biologically requires socialization for it to function properly. We are a social species. We live in much more degrees of isolation than we have in traditional society, but we still recognize that love, acceptance, belonging is crucial for our well-being and our flourishing. Above that would be esteem. This is the kind of sense of value that you have of yourself. How worthwhile is your life based on all this? How are you appraising the worth of what you're doing? Most of us are trying to look at that so that we can flourish. We can achieve something he would refer to as self-actualization, where you have your potential for life. Health is often defined as our ability to achieve our potential. We need the social supports, we need the safety, we need quality housing, we need strong community bonds. We need all those things in order to self-actualize and realize our full potential. And that is us knowing what our unique gifts are for the world and having the opportunity and the encouragement to fulfill our own destinies in that way. What most people don't realize is that as he aged, Maslow added one additional layer to his hierarchy of needs. Again, he's calling these needs. The additional peak he added at the top of this pyramid is something he referred to as self-transcendence. And this is when we're able to get to the point that all of our needs have been met, we've been supported, we've been on our journey, we've self-actualized. And what we realize in that self-actualization is that our own notion of self is what needs to be overcome, to realize our deep embeddedness in the world, the way in which we all need each other to survive, the way in which we are deeply integrated into a natural environment. And so then by self-transcendence, we get into this larger notion of deep belonging and connectivity. I think one of the things that is often missed when we look at drug use is just the effectiveness of drug use as a form of self-regulation. If we look at and acknowledge the chronic stress people are under in today's world, if we in particular look at precarious or disenfranchised communities who do not have adequate housing, do not have safe environments, are having to rely on toxic, poison drug supply, don't really have options for moving out because of our lack of effective social and community services, our lack of new housing initiatives, you can see the way in which our choice to use substances may be a response to the stress we're under as a way of adaptation, and in the way in which we use these substances, whether it's in more marginal environments or stressed environments, or even possibly in your own home life, after work, with friends, the way in which we use substances to self-regulate. Any organism, and we need to remember, we are animals by nature. We have an organism that has natural needs, that is biological in its nature, that's deeply embedded in its environment. We're responding all the time to our sense of internal needs and the needs of the environment. Within kind of more Eastern traditions, and the reason I want to start kind of looking into that is if you acknowledge that I think Bruce Alexander's dislocation theory has some merit. If we look at the advent and the domination of global industrial capitalism, it's created a lot of these mental health crises that we are now coping with. It kind of behooves us, or we would benefit from looking at other wisdom traditions. And for a lot of people, the Eastern traditions have some value because there's a different understanding of self. When you look at Eastern, I'm referring here to things like Ayurvedic medicine, traditional Chinese medicine, Tibetan medicine, they would generally be much more holistic and much more integral than Western forms of medicine. Most Western medicine looks at very particular mechanisms of the brain or body and how one particular pharmaceutical can alter that. A more holistic approach that Eastern medicines would often capture would be to look more at indirect influences on the body. How can we stimulate the body's natural systems to respond in a healing way, in a more counterbalancing way to stress, so it's not so directly targeted in terms of mechanisms? It looks at the whole body as a whole, and it looks at the body's natural healing or organizational ability, and it tries to maximize that. So really, we're looking then at things like adaptogenic response. Within this context, we can clearly understand drug use is a form of self-regulation. It is a way of interacting with the external world, bringing it inside in order to gain a sense of self-efficacy, self-control, in order to feel something different than we're experiencing because it may be difficult. And in that way, we need to understand this notion of self-regulation as a quest for self-efficacy, not in some way as a self-destructive impulse. So what I want to introduce here is a little bit about the wisdom tradition of Buddhism and how that might help us understand different approaches to drug use and addiction. The core belief of Buddhism is that it is our attachment to things that is the foundation of our suffering. Human life is characterized by suffering. We're all born, we're all going to die. We will all lose loved ones. We will all suffer physiologically, psychologically through our life. Suffering is part of the human condition. The nice thing about Buddhism is it's not simply looking at that as a negative, but it helps us understand that in order to overcome suffering, we can look at the way in which our attachments show us the way in which we are suffering. And very clearly, if we're attaching to a behavior or we're attaching to a substance use to allow us to have a certain experience of life or to bring us a sense of peace or fulfillment, we're highly dependent on that activity. And that attachment itself needs to be understood, as a quest for self-regulation, but also as indicating something about ourselves, about our needs. Within this context, Buddhism would look at all of human life as characterized by impermanence. Things that we want to stay the same will inevitably change. We all age. People come and go. Friends you will lose because they'll move somewhere else. Our children grow up and leave the house. Our own bodies begin to fail us as we get older. accepting this and understanding that all of human life is characterized by this impermanence helps us understand our own well-being a little bit better. And it really helps accentuate the need for compassion, because knowing that suffering is at the foundation of much of what we experience, having compassion for ourselves and for each other means that we can kind of hold each other in our suffering in a way that understands the it from. This is something I will use a lot when we're working with clients with addiction issues who are simply trying to self-regulate in a way that lessens their dependence on their drug of choice. And this can be things as simple breathing practices. It can be a matter of being just mindful of your breath. The basic practice can be even counting your breath up to 15, counting 10 inhalations, counting 10 exhalations. If you want to calm your nervous system, the way you breathe and relying on breath work can give you immediate sense of relaxation, of increased peace. And so these are ways in which we can handle the chronic stress of our environment without engaging in things that are forms of attachment by looking at our own abilities. So for example, even if you exhale for a longer count than you inhale, that will be a natural cue to your body to relax. So often when we're in stressful environments and we respond impulsively or compulsively to things, it's because it's become an automatic response. Addiction is a deeply learned habit. Mindfulness practices can introduce a pause, taking a breath before responding to something. It's a way for people to help overcome things like anger responses or losing their sense of becoming frustrated with things. Pause, take a breath, get a more clear mind, because society is filled with things that will rile us up, that will activate the nervous system. A lot of us have anxiety. So learning our own basic tools of self-regulation can help us manage consciousness and feelings in a way in which we can become less dependent on substances. One of the practices that is very common in breathing is called box breathing, where you can look at a balanced breath between inhale to the count of 4, hold your breath for the count of 4, exhale for the count of 4, hold again for the count of 4, and repeat that. That is something that even biathletes, military members will use to calm themselves in conditions where they need to be focused and have concentration. So these are practices we can all pick up on. There is another easy breathwork practice called the physiological sigh, which is really easy to do to attain a sense of relaxation, which will simply mean you have a clearer mind to make decisions on. And the physiological sigh can be prompted simply through 2 quick inhales, followed by an exhalation through the mouth. And if you do that, you can feel the way in which the body almost has a little bit of a reset. Your body has a natural healing intelligence that we can learn to tap into a little more through breathwork practices like this. So when I mentioned earlier that addiction really is a deeply learned habit, I'm building on the work of a writer named Mark Lewis. And he is both a neuroscientist and someone who had an addiction history through his 20s. And he really helps us understand the way in which addictive behaviors are not unlike any other form of mastery that we've learned. We know the concept of 10,000 hours to become a great athlete or to become a great piano player. And this is the fact that if you repeat a behavior, you're more likely to do it again. And particularly if you repeat a behavior ritualistically or with great emotional content, you're more likely to do it again because of the dynamics of neuroplasticity and the way in which learning and memory occur at a synaptic level in your brain. So this is something he refers to as embodied cognition. So we're going to build to the point that we understand addiction as simply a deeply learned behavior, which becomes automatic, which is what a habit is. A habit is a total package of thought, feeling, and action, and they tend to happen automatically, and they're often cued by your environment. Most of our behavior is kind of repetitive. It would be overwhelming to have to figure out reality and what's expected of you every day from the start. That's why babies look often a little bit clueless, because they're taking everything in. It's a bit of an unconditioned environment. The way our brains work is they're governed by something called the free energy principle. Your brain is a remarkably effective predictive organ. It can predict the future based on the past. We're assuming things will be very much like yesterday. And that's how we gain efficiency. That's how we can cut to the chase of things or do new tasks by assuming everything else is relatively going to be the same. This can become a little bit limiting if we become too habit bound. You probably have all been in a situation where, say, for example, you had a social contact or a friend who would always let you down in a certain way, so you judge them and expect them to keep doing it. Your set of expectations, which you communicate to them, creates a feedback loop where they're probably more likely to complete it, but it also cuts you off from the possibility of change and growth. So if that person is starting to do things differently, but you're continuing to see the old behaviors simply because that's what you're used to, you're not really present in the moment. But this is simply the way the brain works. The neurons that fire together wire together. And this is a classic premise of neuroplasticity, meaning if I continue to repeat a behavior or associate a behavior with a certain outcome, and I repeat it and repeat it, it's stored in learning and memory. The synaptic network is consolidated from being a rough little path into becoming a superhighway. So addiction as a deeply learned habit is simply a superhighway. You've learned great efficiency in the brain to repeat a behavior, but it creates something of a rut. And what we want to do is not fall into these deep repetitive ruts because that really limits the horizon of your possibility. So we understand that habit is stored in memory based on past experience and repetition. So it's stored physically at a cellular level within your synapses and the synaptic networks of your brain. It's also stored somatically in your body, parts of your body, particularly the classic examples, if you've had a trauma to a certain part of your body, you tend to contain or store the emotional memory associated with that trauma in that part of your body. People may experience pain in that area. People may store stress in their stomach and you feel that stress there. A lot of people carry themselves rigidly in their neck or shoulders because they're bracing, or people can hunch over because they're trying to protect. These are traumatic memories that are then expressed somatically. But what we have to recognize is that we all contain multiple memory systems. You can have differential memories of different things, and your memory is plastic. Learning is plastic. We can learn new things. And as much as we look at learning generally in our society as something only children and young people do, learning is a lifelong developmental process. We all continue to have neuroplasticity. We all continue to be able to learn new things. Often that requires not just psychological learning or like cognitive learning, but new forms of somatic learning. Learning is often very socially cued. We learn in environments with other people. We can repeat learning by doing it physically, and we can store the memory more if there's a physical component to the learning as well. What does this have to do with addiction? Addiction is a deeply learned habit. Habits, as I've mentioned, are a construct of, it's a total package of thought, feeling, and behavior. They're strengthened by repetition and reward, and they're generally brought on by environmental cues. So say, for example, people who tend to drink more likely after work, it's the structure of the day, it's the witching hour, starting to get dark, you get home, you're in your home environment. Even unconsciously, people could go for their bottle of wine because if they're in the same environment, what's happening is their brain is cued to repeat the same automatic behaviors that they have repeated over time. This is often why, for people trying to overcome addiction, a change of setting is very important. We need to understand that not just addiction, but most of our behaviors are very habitual. Think about your own life. Do you do the same things every day? Does your day follow the same pattern? Are you likely to expect things to be similar tomorrow as they were yesterday? But there's an alternative to this, and this is within Buddhism we refer to as the other shore or beyond habit. This is getting to the place where we're not so dictated by the past or by the imprints of what we believed in the past, the behaviors we have engaged in for certain needs. I think we've all recognized sometimes we've adapted a certain behavior because it suits our needs in the time. And then when the setting environmental needs change or your life changes, you're carrying on the same habits, even if those behaviors don't necessarily serve you at the time. So what is the way to get beyond habit? And it's to be in the present. It is to be here now. One of the great values of psychedelics that I think is underreported in the general mainstream appreciation is the way in which, after these large dosing sessions within psychedelic therapy, people's brain network connectivity is changed. And it's what we have is less activity in your prefrontal cortex, which is where you ruminate, plan, think about your ego. And we have greater connectivity biologically to your limbic system, to your sensory awareness in place. And so what it creates is this opportunity to move past habit into not something that is determined by your past, but can be more in your current context. So this is the importance of mindfulness, awareness of the presence, being able to be absorbed in the present and not distracted thinking about thinking or feeling things that are about the past, not living in the past, not fearing the future, but attending to the present, really showing up for people in your life, really being present, getting out of your own thinking patterns, your self-limiting beliefs, and really attending, being present with people. These are place-based. They're much more embodied ways of being. They're much more dynamic. What it means is we can adapt and be present in our current set of needs and circumstances instead of being determined by things that have become habitual because they had value in the past. Often I think that what complicates our ability to be in the present is grief and loss. I think that not just post-COVID, but this is something that's been a long-term problem, I'd say, in Western society. A Canadian writer named Stephen Jenkinson has described this as a society we are both death phobic and grief illiterate. So we fear death, we hide it away. Very few of us attend death practices or are with people in death and dying processes. We hide people away in hospitals and palliative care units, and we're overcome by a fear of our own mortality. And we don't really know what rituals to call upon to help us with our grieving processes. And again, I think these processes are even more significant post-COVID or in this current time we have with so much loss and illness over the past few years. So how do we be present? How do we sit in complicated emotions? How do we hold our grief? There's a belief in grief care that if we're able to sit in the difficult experiences like loss and be held in our grieving, be supported in our grieving, that grieving, as much as we fear it will consume us, takes a natural pattern of expression over time. And we don't get to the point that we necessarily overcome the grief, but we learn to live with the grief. And the more we can sit in grief, the more we can also hold joy. So I've done some training as a death doula. A large part of my work around addiction has brought me in contact with people, significant illness in the early days of street health and the needle exchange. We lost a lot of people. I've been with a lot of people as they've been passing over. And for me, it's been really clear what we need to do as a society, and I would say within the harm reduction community in general, is get better with our grief practices. The more we can hold our own grief and our own pain, the more we can experience greater joy. So this is moving away from this flatness of consciousness that I referred to being able to both hold complicated and difficult emotions and also celebrate the joy. And so what I want to encourage is that we interact with people in our lives, whether you're a professional interacting with someone with a substance use disorder or struggling with mental health, or even how you acknowledge yourself and your relationship with yourself, is that we approach it with what I would call unconditional positive regard. And this is a concept in human psychology, which means we need to get to the point of complete support and acceptance of a person. And that means in ourselves of all the different parts of our life, our grief, our fear, our loss, our worries, but also our joys and our connection. So when we're working with people, we don't want to see them as a diagnosis. We don't want to see people as a label, because to go back in what I referred to earlier in the talk, you're then missing out on all that other opportunities to see this whole person. So unconditional positive regard means complete support and acceptance of a person, non-judgmental towards their practices. What people do is coming from deep roots of motivation, of histories, of longing, of need. Acknowledging the functionality of drug use is very important to build and sustaining relationships with people. And it also puts you in a position to have a long-term relationship, to help to help provide resourcing with people, to help support them as they go through their kind of change processes, and to express a feeling of belief in a person as opposed to some sort of imposition of a limiting kind of construct. Just to review, this notion of interaction with substances, these are ancient patterns. Archaeological evidence very clearly points to the use of psychoactive drug use, going back into prehistory, which means beyond recorded history. We have cave paintings indicating mushroom ritual, for example, burial rituals in which you've unearthed evidence, clear evidence of psychoactive ritualistic drug use, going back really into Neanderthal times. So this is part of human history. One of the concepts I want to just introduce here really quickly before I start to close, and this comes from understanding histories of what are called shamanism. Shaman is a term from kind of Siberian culture where it was seen as an individual who would be a healer, who would be able to communicate with a spiritual realm, was a bridge into different realities. And in traditional cultures, we have to understand that most physical illness was seen as having an origin in the unseen world, in the psychological world, in the unconscious, or in the spiritual realm. There's a brilliant book called Not Quite Shamans, which looked at the phenomena of Siberian shamanism. And when within the Soviet Union, as it kind of progressed into modern Russia and introduced capitalist society, there was a prohibition on traditional Siberian shamanic practices. So generational shamans were not able to wear their regalia, practice their rites for fear of persecution. And what this created was a phenomena of widespread alcoholism within traditional shamanic families. Within the villages where this was occurring, there wasn't even a sense of judgment of the kind of raging behavior. People would drink to excess, become violent, but there wasn't even a judgment within the community members, because there was a recognition that if people were able to practice their traditional shamanic practices, they would not be engaging in the behaviors they were. There would not be this alcohol dependence, because people had an alternate way of experiencing modifying consciousness that had greater social value. So that really got me thinking, what could we learn from these practices that could help us in our own understanding of coping with substance use? And a lot of it has to do with understanding our need for altered states, the importance of social ritual, the importance of social value of these, gathering together for a higher purpose, and the ways in which we can learn to alter consciousness, which are maybe more beneficial to our health and to society than the ways in which we're seeing in contemporary society. That one of the oldest languages, I think it is the oldest language still in existence, is Sanskrit. Sanskrit is the origin language of traditional Hinduism and Buddhism, but it is also related as a root language in all Indo-European languages. So even modern English has as an evolution with a common ancestor to Sanskrit. So if we want to understand our origins a little better, we can look back into these ancient histories and look a little bit more deeply into our interaction with the natural world, and in particular, our use of psychoactive compounds. The oldest kind of texts, scriptural texts or scriptures still in existence would be the Vedas of traditional Indian Hinduism and philosophy. The Rig Veda makes mention of a substance called soma. This is at the origin of our term soma or somatic, which now means body or parts of the brain. But soma was originally a term used to identify what was called the elixir of immortality. It was a drink that people would consume ritualistically for a religious purpose that would be a plant, but it would also be seen as containing a spirit or a god. And it was considered the elixir of immortality. So many of us as we sort through life, we're seeking greater sense of connectivity, greater sense of meaning, understanding these histories. And in particular, the word soma helps us understand a lot about our bodies, our quest for belonging, our spirituality. So this notion of a substance that we would consume that would give us a sense of unity, purpose, connection with God, a higher understanding of reality, we need to understand is deeply embedded in human history. What's happening in modern times is maybe we're doing this in much more adulterated, less healthy ways, but with the same original desire to connect, to understand this very unique incarnation we have, a spirit with a body, living in context. We're very sensitive to our environment. We relate to these compounds because we have deep histories of co-evolving and interacting with these psychoactive plants. So what does all this tell us? Are we really individuals? Are we that separated from each other? What is the role of disconnection and dislocation in substance use? What are we seeking in substance use? It is this sense of connectivity. I think the remedy we're seeking is a repair of this dislocation of place, being alienated from our environment. If you look at the climate crisis, what we've done to the natural world, we've had an enormous lack of social supports that have gone missing, the death of traditional village life. This great disconnect has probably led to this modern phenomenology of widespread addiction. So with all this taken into account, where do we go from here? What does healing look like? Again, going back to the root of some of these words, healing really means to bring back into the whole. We think of it as somehow fixing us, there's something wrong, it's reparative, but really what healing is a return to wholeness. Here I'm referencing Ram Dass, this notion that we're all on the same human journey. We're looking for certain things to meet our needs. Go back to Maslow's hierarchy, look at the impact of dislocation. I hope by presenting things this way, we can have a much more compassionate approach to understanding of human suffering, to understand this language of the soul people are speaking in terms of expressing what their real needs are, which is human community, connection, purpose, and belonging. Psychedelics are only the more recent kind of fascination we have because they help us understand things about ourselves and about altered states. And if there's any promise in psychedelic therapy, it is probably the ability it has to disrupt habit, to bring us back into place, to help us understand the ways in which the way we're experiencing reality is malleable, is changeable. We can experience greater senses of connectivity. I think the secret out of this is learning to become more embodied, learning to fine-tune our awareness to what our needs are, learning to self-regulate, existing in community with people, valuing community, and continuing to learn. One of the things that we overlook is the autonomic nervous system. We're so caught in looking at neurotransmitters in the brain, we forget to look at things like the vagus nerve, about gut-brain communication. We know that for a lot of us, particularly what trauma does is it affects our autonomic nervous system activity. These are the unconscious activities of the brain. Your nervous system is electrical and alive in spite of you or despite you or irregardless of you. You've been sparked into existence by your nervous system. Things operate with its own natural intelligence. So maybe the trick is learning to live in these bodies and learning to co-regulate with our nervous system, learning these simple techniques to calm, to focus, to bring ourselves into awareness that bring us out of fight or flight that a lot of us are in because of the fast pace of modern society. Learning techniques of self-regulation that include drug use, but other things like breath work, community, healthy practice, meditation, mindfulness, that kinds of thing. So we've covered a lot of ground. I hope this has been helpful. Again, to summarize, it's really important that when we look at understanding addiction, that we acknowledge the term is loaded by a whole lot of social judgment that is not evidence-based or evidence-informed. We need to take a more enlightened approach to understanding the roots of these behaviors, to acknowledging the functionality of drug use, to not separating groups of people into us versus them, to understanding this is a common to the human condition. And in closing, I think I'll offer you this, this is a metta meditation or a loving kindness meditation. May you be safe, may you be healthy, may your life unfold with ease.